Hi, this is Jennifer Minor. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be sharing a really neat tag that features Brayered Stain and Framework today. This is inspired heavily by Tim Holtz and his two techniques on here, and features one of my favorite songs, a line from that, I Want to Go Home, by Michael Buble. So to begin, I'm starting out with a manila tag, and I'm just applying some Stormy Sky Distress Stain to my craft mat, and then picking that up with just a little brayer. I like this little brayer for this technique because it does kind of have an uneven application, and I'm just applying that until I'm happy with it. Put a little more stain down and going over my tag. And once I've got that how I want it, I'm going to go ahead and just do some ink directly to it. I am starting here with the brushed corduroy, and then on the edges I will do some walnut stain. You can just see building up those layers like always. And then once I've got that how I want it, I'm going to actually take my Distress Edge tool, you can see right there, and go over my edges and just kind of rough those up. And once I've got all my sides done, for this card I decided that I wanted to go ahead and put a little more walnut stain over that distressing, which is what I'm doing now. Applying that, intensifying the color along the edge. When you kind of rough this up, the fibers are opened up and they really take a lot more color than they do just if they were left flat. And again, really great distress look. Love this tool. And then now I'm going to go ahead and apply just a little bit of water. I put some, spray some in my hand and then just flick it on my card. And once that's dry, you can see what the water has done there. I'm going to go ahead and ink my stamp and apply that just using the walnut stain right over all of my inking. All of this is dry before I'm stamping this for the background. And now I'm going to take my die cut and I'm just applying Evergreen Bough's Distress Stain right on top of that. And you can see just using the applicator right on it. I do flip this over just to pick up some of that extra ink. I don't want to waste any. And then I went ahead and cut this apart because I knew I wanted it in a vertical formation. And now I'm going to take something deep from my storage box there. I'm going to use some Distress Embossing Powder, and that dauber there is what's called Boss Gloss, and it is just basically like Versamark in just a different format. I don't even know if they make this anymore, but you could use Versamark. So I am off camera, unfortunately, applying my Distress Embossing Powder. And I wanted a pretty light application of this just so it looked, again, kind of grungy, kind of distressed. Tap off my excess and then use my heat gun to set my embossing powder. Brush off the excess there. So it's got those crystals in the embossing powder that don't melt, that release. So you have, again, more grunge look there. And then I am just applying more distress ink right on top of my die, on top of my embossing. And again, I am using the brushed corduroy for this. And just taking my time working that up on my die cut there. And then I decided I want to kind of intensify that green, so I am using distress ink in the Evergreen Boughs right over the distress stain. I just wanted to kind of make it a little more intense than it was with just plain stain. And I'm keeping my two pieces here. Since they are separate, I want to make sure that my colors between the two pieces are fairly similar. And they did stay pretty close. Okay, and at this point then I'm just going to go ahead and adhere my die to my background and just using my Scotch quick dry adhesive. I really like this because I feel that it does not warp the paper, unlike a lot of different adhesives you might try to use on your paper, this doesn't ever warp the paper. And now, in Tim's demo of this particular technique, he actually used different pieces of cardstock or decorator paper, printed paper, but I decided that I wanted to just color each of my own. So I'm inking up one of my little trefoils there. I'm using the Fossilized Amber and then the pumpkin, and I'm just stamping a Harlequin pattern over that in the carved pumpkin. And then adding a little bit of vintage photo around the edge to distress it. And then I'm just going to adhere that right into the center from my die cut. And I do this with all of these pieces. I just create different looks. So this next one is silver, sterling silver embossing powder. I've just applied a little bit of Versamark to that little piece, and then just dipping it in my embossing powder. One thing I do here is I'm heating it from the underside, and this is to kind of keep, since it's a small piece, the embossing powder from flying away. Once I've got it kind of started, I go ahead and start heating it from the top, but that's, I don't know, that's just something I've always done, is heat from the bottom with little pieces. So you can see here I'm doing 3 or 4 applications of this to get this high shine. The multiple layers really creates a smooth finish, as you can see there. So then this one glued into the next spot. There. And then my next little shape, I just stamped teeny tiny music notes there across this one, and then I'm just inking it with antique linen and then a little bit of the vintage photo around the edge. And you'll see a couple of times I re-ink this when it's back in the spot because I felt like it just wasn't intense enough. So you'll kind of see that as we go through. And you, in the background there, can see some of the other shapes I've stamped as well. And just adhering that on the background. And now I am working on one of the shapes. It's kind of a herald type looking lion that I stamped in the Candied apple. And so then I'm just adding a little bit of the Fossilized Amber over that. And then again with the vintage photo right along the edges, and a little bit more Candied apple around as well. And then there, you can see there, I'm adding a little bit more color to the music paper shape. More glue. And then next I've stamped this little bird with a crown, and I'm just coloring that in with my distress markers just straight on the cardstock there. Pretty simple and straightforward, although teeny tiny. Coming back and coloring him, and apologize, I'm really on the very edge of the camera frame here today, and I'm not sure why. So. There he is, and getting glued into the kind of trellis shape there. And moving on to my next little shape, this is a little butterfly, and this one I stamped with the Memento, and then I just kind of scribbled right onto my craft sheet with the distress marker, and then I'm picking it up with my aqua pen there, and then just going over it to kind of intensify some of the lines. This is so tiny and so small. The detail that I put into these is fairly minimal because you would lose so much of it in the tininess of this. But again, just watercoloring with the distress markers. And adding some of the vintage photo around the edge, gluing that baby into the trellis. And going back to my music paper and still trying to make it darker. Just every time I kept adding to the trellis, it just looked pretty plain, so I was trying to intensify that. And then this little one, I stamp the Eiffel Tower. So in the song, one of the lyrics references Paris, so I thought it would be cute to put a little Eiffel Tower in my trellis as a kind of a reference back to the song. And then just added a little shaded lilac and some more vintage photo around the edge, and then gonna adhere that to the trellis, or in the trellis, I guess. Once you've got that, I think is, I really like the silver insert, and then this one I think is my favorite. Just like the way it looks. And then next, I took another one of my little trefoils, and this one I colored with Distress Stain. And this time I used the Stormy Sky just directly on it, and you can see how intense that is. So I'm just putting that one kind of near the bottom. Okay, now moving on to my purple trefoil, quatrefoil. I just inked up a stamp with the Dusty Concord Distress ink, and this stamp is called Ornate Background. And then I'm just going to go over that stamping again with the shaded lilac. You can kind of see, you have to use a slightly different technique when working with really small pieces like this, and you'll see my fingers are absolutely covered in ink. And then again, a little bit more of the vintage photo around the edge on this particular one, and then again just gluing it right into the trellis. And now I'm moving on to using some of the Color Shine sprays. These are by Heidi Swapp, and I started with gold, and then add a little spritz of the mustard, which is this really intense orangey yellow color. And then since this is so small, I don't want a ton of ink, so I'm just kind of picking that up, dipping it into my puddle of color there. And then I'm going to take this shade called Sweet Cherry, and instead of using the spray nozzle, I actually unscrew it, and then I'm using the piece from the inside and just applying, because I just want a little bit of this intense red, and then a quick little spritz of the gold again, and that sends all of that color kind of moving around. And once that was dry, again, just gluing that right into my trellis. And that completes all of the different shapes and elements there. And per usual, you know me, I can't do a card without some glossy accents, so I'm just putting some glossy accents on the stained trellis piece, and then a little bit of the Rock Candy Distress Stickles on the top purple one. It kind of came out a little faster than I was planning, so just using a toothpick to move that around. And now I have my sentiment home, and this I die cut from the Tim Holtz cardstock in brushed corduroy. And now I am taking a product called Metallic Luster by Deco Art, and this is Gold Rush. And this is kind of like a gel, and so I'm just using a little piece of paper towel there to apply this to my cardstock. I'm just going over each of the letters and applying the gold. And I've not worked with this before, but really liked it. And once this dries, you just go back over it with, they say, a dry cloth. And I used a paper towel since I'm working in paper. I figured that would probably be okay. And you can kind of build this up and make it a little more intense, or kind of rub off a little bit and make it a little less intense. But it was very easy to work with. And once I buffed those letters, I was ready to apply them to my tag. And so I just used a very thin foam tape that I kind of cut up into tiny little pieces and put on the back of each of the letters. And I skipped most of that process for you just so you can see there's my little foam tape. And just adhering that right onto the card. And I would not recommend still doing this while your card was wet, but I did. So my glossy accents there is a little wet. But that's alright. And then next, I just use an alphabet stamp to stamp in Walnut stain the additional piece of the sentiment. And then just using my ink blending tool to apply a little antique linen and vintage photo onto my little sentiment piece there. And again, I just used the letters and stamped them, and I wasn't super careful, so they are intentionally not lined up. And then again, just adding some additional color in the walnut stain around the edges for the sentiment. And then I decided that I wanted to add some teeny tiny eyelets. That these are super small. You can see them there. So I just used a 1/8 hole punch and then threaded the eyelets into my tiny little holes. And then I'm just using an eyelet setting tool, and this is kind of the rounded tip that I've put on there. And then you basically just set this like you would a larger eyelet. Just hammer it down and then flatten it. And for these, because they're so tiny, what I do is thread them onto a toothpick first and then put that into the hole, which is much easier than trying to thread the little tiny eyelets by themselves, which of course you can do, but it's getting tired. And so that was a much easier way to do that. Just flatten that out. And these are so neat, and they are so much fun. I love these teeny tiny eyelets. So just a little of my ATG tape on there. Adhere it to the very bottom of my tag. And I'm almost finished. So my next step was to kind of complete the card. So I'm just taking a few of these fibers from eCake Success and just kind of selecting a few of these, trimming them off, and then I'm going to put them together and thread them through the top of my tag there. I like the way this looks. You have a lot of different options when you make a tag. You don't necessarily even have to put anything in the top, but I think it looks nice. And one of the neat things about this particular product is that it kind of came already color coordinated. So these all worked with the palette I used on my tag. Just fold them up and put them through. And then actually I decide that I want my loop to come through the other way. So I trim them and then undo it and then put it back through the other way. Which sometimes this just happens. I just wanted kind of the little loop there because my next step, I take just a little embellishment key that I threaded onto a teeny tiny little safety pin and just thread that onto my fibers. So that was a nice touch on there, and added a tiny little circle paper clip at the bottom as well. And that was the full process for this card. Lots of layers, lots of different elements, but it was really fun and kind of neat to just try some different techniques in miniature on this card. So thank you all so much for coming and watching today, and I hope you enjoyed this. And please feel free to visit me on my blog at jenniferminer.com. Thanks and have a great day.